So here is kind of an overview of what I will be sharing with you. So I first wanted to kind of say where I'm coming from and what is my experience with participatory design, because it's a departure point where I'm talking from. And then I want to focus on important aspects of research that many times when I read literature on design or on participatory design are often not kind of taken into account. So one of them is kind of where is this knowledge coming from? What is the history, very briefly, of this way of working? And what are kind of the general premises of this philosophy and this method of design? And then we are going to move into what we can say is something more practical in terms of methods and tools that we can use. And I want to emphasize or do a little bit more focus on participatory enactment. So I am originally from Colombia, and over there is where I started all the work with participatory design in my undergrad. And then after I finished, I moved to India, where I also did a lot of work on these lines. I'm now obviously living in the US. But I thought it was important to mention this because my experiences are based on those contexts, and they are different from what you experience in the US. But nevertheless, I think those are spaces that we can learn a lot of, from. So just to keep in mind that that's where kind of my knowledge is coming from. And over here, I wanted to introduce, I'm not going to speak about projects specifically, but I did want to speak about the importance of doing, and theory and conversations around participatory design are insightful and important, but I think this is one of the practices in which we have to do it. We have to kind of get into the messiness of engaging with people, with objects, with context. And these are the kind of things that I wanted to highlight about these projects, because they are not kind of trying to prove a point, but they are mostly about being in a space. Or you can see a space in all these pictures, you can see objects, you can see people. And so this is kind of the core of participatory design. So many of the things that I'm going to be talking today kind of come from that dialogue between reading about design theory, but also practicing and sort of challenging a little bit what the theory is saying. So very briefly, participatory design is, I would say, like a design tradition that started in Scandinavia. And this is in the 70s, where in workspaces, they were introducing computers and kind of technologies at the time, but there was this imbalance about who kind of has the expertise for programming these computers. So you had workers and you had managers, and this top-down approach of introducing technology in the workplace. And that generated like this discontent and the opportunity to start creating and shaping technology in a participatory way. So from there is this movement called the workplace democracy movement, and later kind of in the design practice started taking shape as the participatory design practice. So I mentioned this because the discipline as such is coming from a specific context, a specific type of technology, and a specific country, right? Like it's a northern country, and it has obviously expanded to other countries. It has expanded also to other topics of research, and it has materialized differently everywhere. So when I say participatory design, I do refer to the Scandinavian tradition, but in the context I have worked in, and most likely every time you try to do a participatory project, you realize that people already do a lot of participatory processes. So yes, it's a design kind of canon, but it takes different shapes already in many places, and also in the academic world. So when I think about participatory design, I could be thinking about linking it of like participatory action research or feminist participatory action research, which are like different academic fields, but the work overlap. I mean, my work overlap on those. So just to say that this is not kind of an isolated discipline, but it carries not only in creative practices, but also in social sciences, feminism, etc. So this is pretty much like the discipline as such. So I wanted to kind of highlight a couple of bases of what do we mean by participatory design. This is a quote from a paper in 2014 that says the focus today is more on how to do participatory design, or PD, rather than on why. So what we see, and this not only happens with participatory design, happens with a lot of design practices, there is a lot of documentation of how do you do stuff, right? The how to. So toolkits, tools, templates, etc. But what you see less is a questioning of why are we doing this, right? Like why are we talking about participation? So it's a little bit unusual to kind of stop here, but I do want to dig a little bit into what do we mean by actually participating and when it comes to technology. So bear with me for a little bit. But so let's begin with this kind of provocation. These are two researchers who studied the publications of the Participatory Design Conference over 10 years. And they were kind of tracing the definitions of participation that designers use. And they said, they either say that is implicit in their work, it kind of happens, it means the point of view of the users, or it's a mutual learning experience. So this, in my opinion, it does tell us about something about the field, but it's also something that can be applied to any other participatory process. And it's not really telling us much about what kind of the implications of participation. So there is this other work that speaks about two types of participation. And we can speak about a weak or a strong participation. So the weak one is when you involve the users because you want the design to be successful. And he's saying, okay, so users know about their lives, they are experts in their lives, therefore I need to access that expertise in order to make a successful product or a successful technology. So in that logic, participation becomes cumulative. You start developing kind of measurements and you start thinking, okay, how many people do I need to actually get a sense of how their lives are? And participation kind of becomes very like easy, right? Because what you want to get is that inner knowledge, and it doesn't carry major consequences because it's mostly placed in a design process as just kind of a research part of it. And what I feel is also that it falls into the assumption that participating is inherently positive, that the moment that you bring people together, you are doing a positive contribution. And this is very prevalent in many participatory design projects. But there is also another way of thinking about this, and it's what Shapiro will call a strong view on participation, and is understanding that human practices are inherently social. And I would say like research practices are also inherently social, which means that design is involved in a context and it deals with human relations that is not only about sort of bringing people together, but sort of engaging in dialogue, in contestation, in negotiations. So I would say for me, a strong view of participation is to recognize that I'm coming from a space to learn together, to unlearn, to challenge what design is able to do. And participation indeed makes things very complicated. Like, you know, like sometimes I really say to myself, like, why do I want to do again another of these projects if I know it's a mess? I mean, you deal with a lot of things, but it carries like a specific type of learning. It carries a responsibility, it carries a commitment of what you are doing and how are you positioning yourself in relation to others. So that's kind of what I will consider here a strong view on participation, and it's kind of taking the fact that we are working with people very seriously. So this is just a glimpse and just one slide about the contributions from feminism to the practices of participatory design. And what many scholars have said is that we should bring other concerns into the process. So if we are thinking about designing technology and we are thinking about sort of researching something, we should be aware of the contextual forces in which we are. So an analysis of how power kind of plays in the context, how we are placing ourselves in the context, are kind of invitations to think critically. And so this is just to say as well that there is no right way of doing participation, and I don't think there is a good way of doing participation, or like a successful way of doing it, because it's really contextual, and each context brings its own like limitations. So I think it's more about how are we able to negotiate the design process with what we are facing. And so the last kind of component, and we can speak about this later, but to think about participation seriously is the fact that usually participation evokes a number of people, and but very often the role of the designer or the facilitator doesn't take like much prevalence in design processes. So it's kind of understood that we just facilitate the process. But I feel there is a lot to uncover from the individual kind of reflections of designers. So this is kind of a summary of this first part of this presentation. And it's talking about what is our object of design here, like what is our object of research? What do we do what do we achieve when we do participatory design? One is to design processes. So as I said before, is a lot about like the interactions with people. And we also design systems, we design technologies, and all these things are kind of coming together. So we are moving away from understanding design as a like problem solving kind of discipline to a discipline that is able to think on systems and is able to reflect on the social interactions in between. So these are kind of the things that take a lot of that are kind of the important things that we design when we do this type of research. So this is kind of very general, and I know it's very high level for now, and this is why I thought, okay, let's stop here. Oh my God, yeah. And I want to give an overview on how, right? So as I said at the beginning, this is pretty much how, this is the emphasis of many participatory design publications. But I thought like the background was important, and then I want to give like an overview of how to do it. So I'm not sure how you all are familiar with design processes, but I did wanted to bring about this, I don't know, diagram from a particular type of design, which is the canon of human-centered design, which was developed in the US. And this is also an important canon when design started to be something way beyond creating something for people and a way of researching, right? So it will say, well, you start with empathizing with people and just get into a context, and you start defining what you are looking for. You come up with ideas, you prototype, you test them, and then you test until you are happy with your results. And I want to bring this here because a lot of design processes are like this, and it's a process that I have also followed and is interesting. But the participatory design process is different. And this is a diagram published in 2012 by the authors at the bottom. And it's a diagram that I think it's simple, but at the same time, it tells us about the complexity of a participatory design processes. So we are not talking about linear processes. We are not talking about an end product necessarily. We are talking about all these interactions with people. So they kind of define these three main cluster or these three main phases of the projects. One of them is to tell. So it's a lot about like, how do you get to know about people's lives and people's stories, different ways of storytelling. So things like using interviews, using dialogues, creating fiction, creating storyboards with people. Those are all exercises that use language as the tool in which you can research and understand the context. And you also have making, and making is related to artifacts that are created during a design process that help you and facilitate discussions. So fast prototyping is one of them, or prototyping ideas, prototyping technologies with people is also kind of a useful method. And you also have enactment. I will get a little bit more into that, but it includes stuff like body exercises, in general, improvisation. And I put in between this, the words with the gray background, visual thinking if you are trying to do exercises of storytelling. You can also combine what do you have to make in order to get those stories, and what are the different layers of the story that you wanna sort of uncover. So visual thinking exercises are ways in which people can connect and can get ideas of how to tell the story. I will be showing an example in a bit, and I will be also talking about prompts. And this is flexible. I mean, I don't think there is, in my experience, there is no one project in which I had everything planned and it went as I was thinking. Like, things always change because the relationships, and I would say this is very important when we start these processes, the relationships with people tells us what's the next step in a way, you know, like we will realize if people are comfortable doing something or not, and then that kind of gives a space to design things on the go. So this is kind of the last part, and it's an introduction to participatory enactment more specifically. So enactment is a process where people act or perform a given situation. So enactment doesn't require, in the context of participatory design, it doesn't require a script. So it's not kind of a theater play, it's not something that is already set in stone and people perform it. It's a process that allows for improvisation. Improvisation is kind of the main tool. And I think the design skill is the ability to find that provocation, that kind of tension point that allow people to come up with different dialogues, different ways of moving their bodies, different ways of interacting with the space. So I will speak about the process, but that design skill of understanding a context and understanding where do we need enactment. And this takes me to kind of what are the objectives on enactment, when can you use it if you are doing a participatory design process. So you can either, and this is kind of oversimplified, but these are three scenarios. One of them is if you want to understand a situation that happened in the past, you can use enactment to kind of recreate. Or you can use it again for the present, right? To understand, for instance, the present use of a technology, or even like if people are not using technologies, as most of my projects are like that, in which there is an intention of introducing technology in a context, but you first understand how do people do things without the technology, and or you can enact the future. So how things will be if you are using a device, a software, something. So it's I do want to give kind of an overview of how do you plan these sorry, how do you plan these exercises. And it's hard to say like step one or step two, because as I said, I mean, it's really contextual. But these are kind of the things that we can take into account when we are doing enactment. And my idea of like bringing them to light or like showing them is to say, there are so many things that we can take care of, right? And there is nothing that doesn't have a kind of transcendence when we do these processes. And with that, I mean, even the space in which we are working, or the words we use, or the way we build artifacts, or the way we relate to the communities says a lot about our design process. So these are all things to keep in mind. So I start from the left with purpose, and I gave a little bit overview examples of how you can use enactment and what for. Context and provocations, as I said before, the way I have done it is always when I have some understanding of the context we are working with, then you are able to identify what is a good moment to start enacting, what is a good moment to start like coming up with ideas. So that ability of like finding those provocations. Enactment is something that not everyone feels comfortable doing. It's something that many communities may not be even used to do or haven't experienced before. So enactment is an exercise that I wouldn't recommend using at the beginning of a participatory process. For me, I always use it when I have built up some trust and I kind of understand how comfortable people are or not doing this. So it's important to keep that in mind, because not everyone is comfortable doing it. But also once you know that they will be willing to do it, warming up and kind of interacting with the others before starting the improvisations is really useful. And warming up is from exercises where they just walk around the place, or they get to meet the rest of the people, or they get to a body position that they haven't done that day, and all those exercises that help you kind of lose a little bit the tension. And I will be talking about iterations, which is something, it's a little bit like after, this is something I did after I have done this many times, and is understanding that enactment is not like two people kind of perform or improvise a situation, but the audience are the people who are looking at this enactment can also participate, right? So it's interesting to think on how those iterations can happen. Like, can people, for instance, stop the enactment and come up with an idea? Or can people join the enactment at some point? When I said people, I mean the audience. Or can people shut up the actors? So what are, like, it's, and the possibilities are many, right? Like how do we make the audience kind of participate rather than becoming a theater play, which is not. And then artifacts. So I would say one of the things is that sometimes we are enacting a situation, like for instance, when we do the future, the situation hasn't happened yet, but we expect that it was going to happen somewhere, right? It can be in the bedroom of the person, or in the public space, or whatever it is, and you can kind of try to emulate that context within the enactment space, and that's super helpful because it is not like creating a room in the place, but it gives a sense of familiarity. What I have done in the past is, if I want to do an enactment exercise, I will ask the community to bring objects from their homes, when we were talking about technologies for the home space. And we will build up like a small stage kind of thing that is kind of familiar to what we are doing. And I will also speak about prototyping, which is another type of artifacts, and documentation. So as if you guys are familiar doing design processes or creative work, documentation is crucial, and we sometimes don't think about it beforehand. But for enactment specifically, I feel documenting this process as well is important for a variety of reasons. One is we can go back and sort of see what happened and how it happened. But also enactment is a moment when politics play, right? Like someone could be appropriating the narrative, or the narrative could have gone to another direction. And in the moment, you are just doing it and helping facilitate the process, but then having things documented kind of help you rethink what you thought you experienced. So these are kind of, I don't know, like general, I wouldn't say steps, but like things to keep into account when you are planning an enactment exercise. So this, I just wanted to show, and just to finish, kind of 3 examples of the artifacts that help facilitate enactment. So this is a very messy storyboard made by a group of students I work with, and it was made by them and the community members. And it was in the context of understanding how health workers, which are women who provide health advice to the community, kind of go about their job in an everyday basis, and they started mapping where do they go, what do they do, and this is something that only them could understand, right? Like if a student showed this to me, I'm like, what do you do? I don't know what you're doing. But it really doesn't matter, right? Like I don't need to understand them because it was part of that conversation that they were having. But what's very interesting is that they started already mapping a lot of like relations among people, a lot of interconnections about like places and objects. And these, when they were starting this, they used these to brainstorm how to do enactment. So what do we want to enact? And they were like kind of identify what is the relationship that we want to get more into. So it was a lot about between this health counselor and the patients. And we want to think about the book where they keep the records, and how does book play a role into the relationship they are building. And so it was, I will call this a storyboard, or like board that help us to ideate and come up with ideas for enactment. And as I said before, enactment was never kind of the first tool, it always came after this type of engagements in which we understood the context with the people. And this is another type of things that we will do during enactment. So as I was saying before, like the different iterations that you can come up with for making the audience participate. So we will do this, is called fast prototyping, and it's using very low cost materials like cardboard and markers and paper to create an interaction in the spot. So when we think about designing technology with people, obviously we are not bringing like software that is pre-made, right? So, but that shouldn't stop us from understanding like the interaction and the kind of the sequence of activities while using technology. So this fast prototyping and low cost prototyping is a way that help us get an idea of how people will use the technology, and these things were done on the go. In this case, we were doing enactment, and we will stop the enactment when someone raised a red flag from the audience, and they will say, well, now we will need to access information. So let's access the information, and someone will make a screenshot of it, and the enactment will continue by incorporating that specific screenshot into the activity. So we were testing a lot of interactions that way. And it proved to be very efficient because you really don't need to code anything or like making finalize in order to test technology. And these are kind of the kind of documentations that I kind of got my students involved in. And I think every time we were planning enactment, this was very helpful because we already had kind of a photographic account. We had a lot of like comments and, you know, like the subjectivities of the students coming into the documentation. And these were the kind of things that help us say, like, okay, so if we want to do an enactment of a situation, maybe we can make something appear like this, and we will have all this mood board that will tell us ideas of how to decorate the space or who to involve in the enactment. And this is a project timeline of not only an enactment exercise, this is a whole participatory project that after enactment and after like iterating things, we came up with an application for the health counselors. So just as a, and if you have more questions about it, maybe we can talk about it. But these are the things that I feel, I haven't even read this anywhere, but these are conclusions kind of from my experience. I feel if we kind of overcome the utilitarian view of a participatory design process, like if we understand these processes less about designing technology as the final objective and more about the creative process, there is a lot of like confidence that people gain, right? Because you are kind of opening up the creative process to communities, to people. So there is a lot of confidence that is created, which I think is one of the like amazing outputs of these projects. And also to understand when we do participatory processes around technology, I think it's important to draw the boundaries around the technological fix and to understand how much do we need to design a technology and how much we cannot solve or we cannot design. What are those social constraints that are not even going to allow this technology to work? So kind of defocusing from the technology sometimes I think is important. The third one is that deployment of technologies after participatory processes is a whole project altogether. So during participatory processes, I often kind of the final deliverables for just to say it that way, are all these prototypes, are mock-ups of how technologies are, and then the process of building technologies starts. And this is, of course, communicating with engineers, with programmers who can make it real. But this is, I mean, participatory processes goes until a point, and just to make workable technologies is another story. And the other last thing is that not everyone feels comfortable in a participatory design process. Not everyone can assume the same role during these processes. So what it's important for me is just to enjoy it and in the way that I can, you know, like there are certain contexts in which I don't feel as comfortable being the facilitator. I may assume another role. But for me, like participatory processes are there to enjoy, you know, like to find your own space within that. So thank you for listening. Yeah, that's it on my side. So I'm going to, oh, I think, yeah, so I invite you, okay, Shima was writing that. Yeah, so I invite you to type questions or comments you have. I will be happy to read it and sort of build on that. Okay, so I see there are two questions. The first one is interesting. It says, is there anything between strong and weak participation? So I guess this is referring kind of that middle ground. And I would say yes, of course. I don't want to pose a binary or something like that, and I don't want to say that things are black or white. As I said, that it is very hard to say what is good participation. You know, it's very hard to say when did you actually participate correctly. Right? I don't think there is nothing like that. But I feel like if you have a commitment, and this commitment is personal, professional, political, that's a strong view. And or if you see participation just as bringing people together, that's a bit weak, because then there is no real responsibility that you are taking on. So it was more in those lines, like what is the commitment that you are having, and in between that you can have like different types of commitments, and many things fit into. But I think that distinction, I think it's what I was trying to get at too. And of course, in between there are many ways of doing it. There are like countless ways of doing it, because there are countless contexts. Not sure if I replied correctly, but let me know if you have any questions. So there is another question from Agent Spock. It says, how do participative, as we'll say, participatory design processes account for decision making in multidisciplinary teams, often involving engineers, scientists, or creatives like artists and product designers? Are design processes universal and agnostic to disciplinary backgrounds and intents of individuals? Okay, so there are two questions here. But I think the first question of how does these processes account for decision making is a question that sort of travels across research in general. And I will say any type of research sort of faces the same challenges and is accounting for who makes decisions and in what context. In my experience, I have involved engineers in participatory design processes, and I don't think I can pinpoint exactly what the decisions that they were making, or the designers were making, or artists were making, because that's kind of the whole point, that there is no, we try to avoid that distinction of who is making what decisions. Like the whole point was to bring design students to think in similar ways with the engineering students, and to think in similar way with the artist students. I don't know, I feel like it's really positioning. It's really positioning what is design doing, what is computer science doing. I can't say much about that because it's such a general question, but I will say it's more a question about where is knowledge creating and in participation. And that each project replies that differently. And if design processes are universal and agnostic to disciplinary backgrounds, I would say no. I don't think there is anything like universal design processes. And that's what I was trying to get at the beginning of the presentation, of saying there is, I mean, yes, it started in Scandinavia, this whole tradition, but it materializes very different in contexts like India or in Colombia, where I have had experiences, and I'm sure it may materialize differently in the US. So I will say not. And in terms of disciplinary backgrounds, again, I think the whole point of participatory processes is to bring different people to talk, to, you know, like to be able to have a conversation beyond the words, and using all these proofs and creative tools for having the conversation. But yeah, again, if you want to follow up on my response, the person that asked it, you're welcome to do so. Okay. And the third question, it says, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for being here. I'm wondering in what participatory context the technological development stage would be implemented. at what point is there a qualitative or qualitative process of evaluating something successful? Yeah, that's a great question. Um, so from my experience, and also what I was sort of pointing at towards the end of my presentation, I always have worked with technological development as a second big stage after what I will say kind of the core participatory process, because the objective of participatory processes is less about coming up with a workable technological solution than understanding the context and the needs and the specifics for that technology to exist. So if we understand this as an objective, then that's kind of the limit. That's how, as much as it is expected, not to say that it is not possible to do a participatory process for the technical development, but in reality, I would like to say, yes, we develop the technology and then we go back to the people and we test it and we go back and change it and prototype it. But that would be ideal, right? And that's what I thought I could do initially when I started doing this. But in reality, it's not that easy because developing technology takes time, takes people's work time. And I usually work in collaboration with NGOs and with engineering departments. And you are dealing with people who have different priorities. So in reality, things are not so straightforward. So I would say the technological development in my cases has always come after understanding the context, and it takes a while until we have a workable solution that can be tested again. And the question of at what point is there a qualitative or quantitative process of evaluating something successful? I think it also depends on how far are you trying to get things done, right? Like I feel if the objective is to create a workable solution, then the question is, do you want to be the one who is providing that solution, which means you are the one who is providing support and technical support for the community, or is it something that people can take on their own and just use it for some time by themselves and see what happens? Or, so I think it depends on how are you positioning the technical development and who has the power to do it. And the idea of being successful, I'm a little bit skeptical. Well, I guess if you have like a well-defined objective of what was this made for, then you have something to measure. But in my cases, I have always started from what is needed in this context and why. And then you introduce something to see how that technology sort of changes relations or make a relationship different. So it's less about success of the technology, although in other contexts it could be, right? It could be like the technology is meant to alleviate a process or the other. And I guess you need people to use it over time. And then just after a while, do another participatory project to understand. I will say like more like a qualitative approach to understand what the use of the technology has been. So again, if you wanna like follow up on that, I'm happy to read any other comments. So there is another question. So it says what am I? Sorry. Yeah. In the case that the objective is an open processual understanding is contextual need, how do you see the relationship between participatory research and participatory pedagogy being bridged? Okay, it's an interesting question, and it's something that I've been wanting to write for a long time. So I would say first, there is a blurred line between a research process and a pedagogical process. If you think about the processes that I have described here, they are very like on the lines of pedagogy as well, because they are learning processes in which you design something to facilitate learning, to facilitate conversations. And those are processes where people go through a learning experience, and there are outcomes as well of this. So I think on one side they are blurred, like that's really in between those two things. enactment is something that has been used as a pedagogy in multiple contexts. And in this case, it's pretty much the same, right? It's just opening up a different type of engagement for generating knowledge. So it's very blurred. But on the other hand, many times I have done these processes as a facilitator or as a faculty member with students, which means that there is a kind of an underlying process there of what is the learning if you are a design student, if you're an art student, or an engineering student. And so that brings us to perhaps, and I can come back to this picture over here, brings us a lot. What we can see here is the design pedagogy kind of underlying the participatory process in a way, right? Like you have, like I had to come up with a lot of sort of a structuring of the project, not only to make successful our interactions with the community, but for the students to see what are they doing, right? And for them to make sense of what is going on. So it's blurred, but at the same time, in the context of education, it requires that planning as well. And I think that's tied to what I spoke initially about the strong view of participation. Is not just bringing students together, because if you have many people equals participation, it's like, it's bringing people together to like really think together and question and challenge what design can do. So that's the pedagogical aspect, which is hard. And I used to be like attached to kind of design for some time, and those kind of processes show me perhaps what the other person was asking: how does it account for different ways of thinking and different disciplines? So I think all those are questions that kind of get into the pedagogy side of things in the context of education, but otherwise it's quite blurred.
Hi, Catalina. This is Adashima. So if there are no more questions, I want to thank Catalina for her presentation. I learned a lot. I really enjoyed this presentation. We will have a recap post coming forward, and as well, this presentation will be recorded. It was recorded, rather, I should say. So that will be included inside of the recap post.
Awesome. Thank you so much for hosting it, and thank you to everyone that was here.